This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Debbie Carroll. Debbie is a Southampton-based garden designer with experience in designing for care homes and other health settings for residents with dementia. Her work in these surroundings prompted her to question why these gardens were not more actively used, even when they were designed to the latest design guidance. Along with her fellow designer Mark Rendell, they researched what hindered engagement with the garden, in particular for people living with dementia.
I'm a garden designer that's celebrating 20 years this year, and I got into gardening really from a young age. It was just something our family all did. If we didn't grow it, we didn't eat it. And it evolved from there, which was amazing. I studied at Spa Shop, and I'm so fortunate. I've had such a wide range of clients over the years, but I've always had an interest in gardens that could benefit people. And back in sort of 2010, 2011-ish, I was asked to redesign 3 care home gardens for dementia back to back. But what was interesting was that all 3 had been designed before but fallen out of use. And at that time, I was relatively inexperienced in that field. And it seemed strange to me that they felt that having me as a relatively new designer in that area, that it would make the difference. And so it led to a research project with a fellow garden designer, Mark Rendell, to want to understand what might be missing from the design guidance, because these gardens had been designed before but fallen out of use. And so we thought there was something missing, and we thought we'd do a little research project, self-funded, which became a huge research project, and the findings of which led to the formation of Step Change Design to share with our designer colleagues, but also with the care sector itself as well, to help create actively used care setting gardens, and in particular for people living with dementia. Though our findings since have really translated wider to most organisational settings, anywhere where the organisation may influence whether the users can actually access the garden or not. And it was all driven from wanting to make sure that if I designed a garden, it would be used long after I had left, whether that be a domestic garden for my, domestic clients, or a care-related or other organisational related setting. I didn't want to be designing gardens that were not used, not loved. And also these days, with sustainability in mind, that's far from being environmental to redesign and rebuild gardens constantly. My view through all of my work has been the gardens that last are the gardens that are loved. And to do that, we need to understand our clients. And that was where some of the key reveals came in our research project.
As you say, it obviously turned into a very big body of research, but can you give us an overview of what you found when you started to research these gardens and why they weren't being used?
Yeah, I mean, Mark and we created this project that we worked with 24 care homes across England and Wales. And on the very first visit to the very first care home, we were blown away by a bunch of dandelions and buttercups in to our eyes, a poorly designed garden. And earlier in the day, during a visit round the gardens at this home, we were told, in response to my question of, what about the weeds and the gaps and, some of the things that perhaps were not what I would expect to see in a dementia garden, I was told by the care home manager that they were useful for some of the residents. In that afternoon, we had to reconsider our own thinking around what made an actively used and meaningful garden. We watched these dandelions that we'd been told were useful, used to help unlock a person with dementia to go on and enjoy the garden. And we had to reflect on the fact that as designers, if we'd been there as designers instead as researchers, we would have removed some of those things that actually made it meaningful. And this home was actually practicing in a very different way from the way our design practices tend to work. So it was that and a whole host of other contradicting and contrasting stories across 6 months that led us to 3 key findings, really. The overarching thing is very much related to the way that care is delivered. So the overarching finding was that those care settings that were practicing what is known as person-centered care, so care focused around the individual, will actively engage with the garden, regardless of its condition, whether it's been designed or otherwise, and that they will engage outside throughout the year because they're trying to deliver what residents wish and to try and meet their needs and requirements. The second finding is that if there's a health and safety fear at that setting, that will cap engagement. So unless health and safety is overcome in a positive way to be positively risk assessed, no matter what garden we create, there is a high likelihood it will become unused. And the third finding took us a lot longer to identify, and is the one for us as designers and for those of us who support in a horticultural way within care environments, is very much that we need to match where the care environment is currently on its organisational culture. So if you've got a home that is not truly person-centred, that is perhaps fearful about stepping outside, is very task-orientated in its delivery of care, we actually need to support them on a journey to more person-centred care. That seems like it's not related to our design work, but actually understanding organisational culture is absolutely critical to ensuring a garden will be actively used long after we've left. And there can be a danger that we can inadvertently build back barriers to engagement. And so actually we do need to understand organisational culture. And that's a new thing, really. We need to make sure that we actually match them to support them to improve their care practices, which is the requirement of the Care Quality Commission across England and Wales, and help them to achieve that. And that actually we are not hindering that progress to that route. And so matching their current position and coming alongside them, not expecting the garden to be the driver alone. It is actually people that drive engagement with the garden. And that needs to be at the forefront of the way we deliver our design and the context in which we deliver our design.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think that it is becoming hopefully more widely known and practiced that, you need to get all the stakeholders involved at the beginning of the design process. Do you have any specific ways that you do that?
It's actually about building it in right at the very beginning. So in the same way that most of us as garden designers would go in to collect an initial brief and to capture the site analysis, to measure up or capture soil samples and to understand the orientation of the site. And all of that information helps us with things like making sure we put the right plant in the right place. We need to expect at that early stage to be capturing information about a way the care organisation works, that we're capturing where they are in their organisational approach so that we apply our design skills to that context. And so we've created several books, tools and numerous articles. All of the articles are free. The books and tools obviously paid for on our website that can help give you some headlines, but there are some real quick wins to look at. So we have 5 questions we suggest people look at when they go. First one that's really revealing is, how are they using the garden they already have? Very often the garden is blamed, but 9 times out of 10, it is rarely actually the garden that's at fault, even if it might be bland or quite simple and perhaps not as pretty as they might like. There's often not a good reason why that can't still be being used to some degree. And so actually that can be really revealing in the information they provide you when they explain why they believe they don't use the garden. Also take care, is there a garden wish list? So Mark and I have been to care settings where they've presented a lovely wish list that they've got all the stakeholders and focus groups on. And one care setting had a £20,000-30,000 wish list of all sorts of things they thought would make this garden actively used. The door was locked, and on investigating why, it turned out that there was the lack of a handrail at the step at the access. And the one thing that was not on the wish list was the handrail. And so this garden was potentially at high risk of failing because that was just not in their subconscious. Very often the thing that's really getting in the way gets forgotten and overlooked and still not addressed. And so once we've left and the novelty of a new space has worn off, so the garden will go back to being used the way that it was before you even arrived. We also suggest that you take a look at who's the key contact. Do they have an agenda? And is that agenda aligned with what the residents really need? Is it person-centred led? And we often find sometimes with people in care environments that the marketing person is a driver for change and they want the pretty pictures, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing stopping us creating beautiful gardens, of course. But actually, if that's at the risk of undermining resident engagement, then that garden is no more than a shop window display and not actually a meaningful space. And so it's addressing those things to make sure that garden goes on to be long-term used. And then we also ask, what are the residents looking at? Can they even see outside? So when you first arrive, Can you even get to the doors? Can you see out the windows? Are all the chairs facing internally? We turned just 6 chairs around in one care setting, and immediately residents with dementia were talking about the garden, going in the garden unprompted. And for one lady, within 24 hours, it improved her sleep, her mood, and her appetite simply by making her able to connect with the garden more realistically, by creating a social space that was able to engage with the garden so naturally by simply turning 6 chairs around. And the last thing we often start, in fact, we actually start with, Mark and I, is do they truly have an open door policy? We have a habit of asking that question, to which most care homes will always say yes, of course. And many will sell their garden to people who are thinking of putting their relatives into a care environment, but actually will try the door if they've said yes. Every door that enters into a garden space that appears to be secure, we'll try the door. And invariably we find them sadly locked, or we find them going through complicated keypad processes, or trying to find the person who's got the key that day. Stepping into the garden in our own homes is the most natural thing we do. We simply step out the back door. And we need to find ways that in care environments that is facilitated and is possible as well. And immediately, if you're encountering locked doors, that can be an indicator quite often of fears around health and safety and risk-averse settings. And that has to be overcome if your garden is going to go on to be used beyond the initial novelty value. So those are sort of 5 WIC areas to look at that first visit that will give you lots of information. And if you keep in mind that mostly the garden is not at fault, yes, it can be improved, but mostly it is not at fault if people are driving it. Those things need to be addressed before your garden is created or alongside it. Otherwise, your garden will potentially fall out of use. And the one thing that they tend not to do is call back the same designer who designed the first garden if it falls out of use. So it's not good for us as a sector in terms of ongoing work. We've created an approach to delivering our design we call relationship-centered design. And it is about a longer-term relationship and smaller interventions over time to support them on a journey to improved care practices as well.
It's interesting what you said about it being a shop window and people wanting to have these all singing, all dancing spaces that have got a lot of functionality and also look really good. But actually, also bearing in mind what you said about the dandelions, obviously there's a lot to be done in terms of making the safe space and easy to navigate so that people can get around it okay and that they can do so safely. Although, is there maybe an argument for the fact that we over-design these spaces sometimes, and that once you've got the hard landscaping in place, especially with the planting, that actually you could leave it a bit more naturalistic and it would still be appealing and still kind of resonate with the people who are using it?
I'd say it's perhaps not even necessarily about the naturalistic. It's about really working to that particular setting, that individual set of residents. And the people who know those residents best are the carers. So sometimes it's about us allowing the time and space for the care team to be able to evolve the space we created. So sometimes we might just want to make the bones of the garden sufficient paths and social spaces in sun and shade, with some purposeful elements in it. But actually, a lot of it needs to remain very flexible. Sadly, many residents in care homes are not there for very long, sometimes as little as a year or 18 months for many people with dementia now. And actually, their needs and abilities on any day may change. We're not there every day to help them facilitate those changes. So we need to take care about too many things that are bolted down that can't be changed or evolved when we've left. And in terms of planting, we err towards the sort of domestic and familiar, keeping the scale and style, particularly for where there's people with dementia, familiar to what you would expect to be, say, in a back garden. If it's meant to be a back garden, it needs to feel like a back garden or a front garden. So take care about not adding in elements or items that perhaps would be more familiar to a public space, or that are too conceptualized and hard to understand or grasp or read. It needs to be an easy read. And in terms of planting, really familiar plants, even if the care group don't know their plants, things that they would be able to point at and go, oh, I've had that in Granny's garden, or, oh, I know those, I love those, even if they don't know the names of them. Very often a lot of our AGM plants and those real good doers that we love within the horticultural sector are often really good plants, but they need to feel familiar to really resonate. But yeah, I think there is a huge danger. And by over designing, we do it with the best of intentions, very often most people don't design in this sector unless they really have a desire to help people and to help that connection with nature. But sometimes we can do more than is needed. And if that fails, that actually leaves a residue of a legacy of fear or undermining confidence in the care group. And so that could actually mean the doors are more firmly locked after we've left as well, which is not what we were intending. We very much want to keep those doors open and make it really fluid. I'm determined that by the time I might need a care home, those doors are firmly open and that I can step out, or I'm facilitated to step out as and when I choose, doing the things I would like to do out there. And they're often the simple things, sitting with a cup of tea, watching the birds and the insects, pottering in the garden, all of those very simple things many of us do in our gardens. So yeah, we do need to take care of over designing. And actually, if you build a relationship with the care setting, if it's worked as a simple stage, then they bring you back in for the next stages to evolve that over time.
It's a scary thought, honestly, to think that you could lose your freedom to explore outdoors in that way. And obviously your work's done a real lot to bring this particular field forward. And I was wondering if you had any examples where you've had really good results. You could actually start, if you wanted to give some examples where you've not had such good results and you've learnt from it, but I'll leave it to you which way, whether you start with a positive or negative, but it would be good to hear some examples.
It's probably easier to do some of the examples of what we saw within our research study, actually, because it was the contradictions and the contrasts that helped us reveal what the findings were. And I think particularly around health and safety is an interesting area. So we went to one care home where we saw an open pond, and our designer hats were, oh my goodness, this looks dangerous. And it had a rickety, and I mean really rickety, low trellis fence around it as a sort of barrier, but it would have done nothing if you'd have leant on it. But through the course of 3 visits there, we witnessed these lovely ladies who sat every day on a nice day by this pond, watching the fish and listening to the sounds of the waterfall. And it was set back from the main patio. They didn't like to be on the busy patio, but they could see the goings on without being part of it. And when we inquired about, aren't you worried about the risks around this pond, we were told what felt like quite a flippant comment. We got a lot of these sort of flippant comments around, well, if they could get over the trellis, that would be the miracle. Actually, it took the 3 visits to understand that they were risk assessing way beyond how we tend to risk assess within design environments. They were risk assessing the individuals. They knew which residents were safe to sit by this pond unsupervised versus those that needed close supervision who were on the main patio or elsewhere within the setting. This home was an outstanding home by Care Quality Commission guidance. If we'd been there to design, we would have probably have put big barriers around this pond. We may have even chosen to fill it in. Now, I'm not suggesting we put a pond in every home. In fact, another home we went to, when we talked about ponds and water with them, you'd have thought that a teacup full of water would have drowned somebody. In a home that was that fearful around health and safety, a pond would clearly be inappropriate. To be truly person-centred, you need to know enough about your residents to be able to balance risk versus benefit and then work out what you can apply. And actually, the care setting needs to remain in control. And so it was a real wake-up moment for Mark and I, and we saw numerous other examples like this, where settings were working beyond our norm for our sector. We tend to think about risk in a generic way, and that's great. But actually, if that generic way would hinder them delivering person-centered care or remove benefits that could be really meaningful to residents, then we've actually undermined them in achieving their own regulatory requirements. So it was an interesting thing for us. We also saw lots and lots of use of what Mark and I now sort of refer as gimmicks, really. There's no other way around it. We saw lots of things like post boxes and phone boxes and bus stops with all sorts of reasons around why they were included, around reminiscence and bus stops that would make people calm by sitting waiting for a bus. But equally, we started to understand how these actually were not helpful and that actually they could add confusion, and they made it harder to read the space. What was this space? I don't have a bus stop in my back garden. And if I'm confused about where I am today and there's a bus stop and then a bus doesn't come, how does that make you feel? And so we came up with a series of questions to sense check items and activities around whether they're purposeful, realistic and in context, relevant and meaningful for individuals or for that group of residents, and whether there was an opportunity of spin-off activity. And if you answered no to some of those, then it wasn't appropriate for that setting. And so, we saw wash lines really well used in many settings. But actually, what I'm really conscious of is that as designers, we're a bit like magpies. We hear a great idea and we think, I must put that in my next garden I design. Please, anyone listening, not every home should have a pond. A home that is poorly performing in terms of its person-centered care, actually, it could be dangerous to add it. But don't go putting a wash line everywhere either. We saw a great example where it would have been meaningful. In fact, this was a garden that I designed. The activity team knew from their residents that a wash line would be meaningful. I designed a wash line in. It was never put in because the marketing person thought it made the garden look untidy. And yet we then saw another garden where a wash line had gone in, but it was removed because of a health and safety concern. They felt it was a ligature risk to everybody, so it was taken out entirely. And a third garden where we saw a wash line and a little error as well. And a lady, that was her job every day. She hung the washing for the home. It was a real job. All the tablecloths and tea towels were her job to hang every day out on the line. Very often she had to go out, bring them back in when it was going to rain and vice versa all day long. That was her task because that's what she loved to do. That they had identified that as a meaningful task for her. And for that home, that wash line was important. So wash lines actually are worth a consider, but actually it has to be right for that setting. If you were to add anything in particular, I would add seating. Bizarrely, the number of homes we see with not enough seats or benches. And if there are seats outside, that can mean that people will stay up to 20% longer. If we were looking for the golden nugget, there isn't one, unfortunately. We identified 304 different things that people engaged with in our study, and very few of them stood out, and most of them were driven by people. So, for example, following on from the seating one, if people took a meal outside or drinks outside, they'd stay 80% longer. For that to happen, that does mean we probably need to design in spaces for people to sit and eat outside and tables, etc. But actually, for that to really happen, the culture has to be in play that they're expecting to do that and are prepared to bring meals outside. We also saw that if someone went out with other people in a care home, so they were accompanied in some way, they would also spend 50% longer outside. So we can create the best gardens that we wish, but if we understand the culture, we can help them get even more out of it by helping them to activate the people side of it as well. So I'm afraid to say there's no one golden bullet. It is about know your client and your clients knowing their residents.
And I think that's always the case actually with gardens. It really is what the space is going to be used for. The best ones are the ones where people live in them and live with them and develop them and, really understand the space and its needs and the function it performs. And yet it's difficult as designers to parachute in and then try and take all this information and churn it into something useful. Although it is obviously clearly from your work possible, it just requires maybe a little bit more thought and also an understanding, I think, of particularly what you said about the health and safety and how all the different people are approaching that. In terms of trying to find a happy medium, again, I guess that's organisation specific, but is there a conversation to be had and is there a way forward so that everybody's comfortable with the level of risk involved? Does that just come down to you all sitting down around a table and kind of chatting it through?
Yeah, I mean, the risk one is a tricky one, isn't it? And it's really important. None of us wants to put anybody at risk, nor to put ourselves in a position that could compromise us as individuals or our businesses or reputations. But what was really interesting is that we are at odds a little. We as a sector generally work from the more risk adverse side of things, but the Care Quality Commission requires care environments to work to a positive risk assessing approach at an individual level. And there are occasions where our generic approach can hinder their own actual achieving of that. So what I've found in environments where I've worked is that it's perfectly right to flag the concern. I flagged the concern about the open pond, even though I was not there as a designer. And it took a bit of digging to understand what they were doing to mitigate the risks. And they were mitigating the risks through the way they risk assessed the individual people. So what we found was homes that are truly person-centered are risk assessing the people and their ability to safely engage out there and with the things that are there, whereas we tend to risk assess the things. So it's perfectly right for us to flag the risks we spot or that come up in our design thinking or conversations. But actually, ultimately, the decision about what level of risk to take must sit with the care organisation. It's right for us to explain the risks, but they equally mustn't ignore, because they're required in their own regulatory requirements, to balance that with the benefits. There are residents in care homes who go skydiving. So I can't think of anything worse that would just terrify me. I'd be scared to death. My own level of risk v benefit would not want to do that. And actually, people are entitled to still take risks, even though they live in a care environment. So yes, we should build safe structures, safe surfaces, make our doorways and things accessible. But actually, beyond those initial things, the conversation needs to remain with the care environment taking the final decision, because they need to weigh it up for them and their organisation and their residents' benefit. And that's the only way that it can really progress. And that can be documented, so it's clear about who's taking that final decision. So it's not about us abdicating, not flagging a risk, but we need to be prepared and be careful not to immediately assume, because we flagged a risk, that they see it as a risk. They may see it as an opportunity for some residents who would gain something by that risk. And that's slightly at odds to the way that we generally are taught and trained within our own sectors. So it is a tricky area, but there are conversations to be had, and working it through together, of course, but ultimately the final expert who will be there long after we've left will be the care setting and that organisation themselves.
You said about having the doors of all the care homes open by the time you come around to needing one.
Yeah.
So thinking about the sort of sector as a whole, thinking about the residential care settings, how confident are you that things are kind of moving in the right direction? Are there any particular challenges that you think should be dealt with over the coming years, or are you fairly positive about the whole situation?
There's still a lot of work to do, but over the 10 years that Step Change has been sharing its work, and we've been sharing it probably more in the care sector than in the design sector until more recently, things are moving forward. And that is partly because the Care Quality Commission's framework came out about the same time as our study results. And we were fortunate. Our findings echoed what they were suggesting, this person-centred drive. So things have moved forward. There is at least expectation that people ought to be able to step outside freely. There are still many settings where that is stated but not happening in fact. Health and safety fears amongst themselves, which are often driven by myths that may or may not really be true in reality, often hold homes back from opening those doors. I was in a home just last week. I was asked to judge a series of homes, and in one particular home, they had a quite complicated series of keypads to get out the door. They had a perfectly secure garden, accessible with sensible paths, nothing broken or damaged. But there was a perception that the outside was more dangerous than inside. And yet, actually, when I looked at the outside space, there was nothing out there that was any more dangerous than inside. In fact, there was more opportunities to build strength, to gain vitamin D, to improve mental health and well-being. All of those things we know that going outside are good for us for. And yet there was a perception that outside was more dangerous. It is a different set of risks from inside, but the care they were delivering inside can carry on across the threshold outside. In that particular setting, there was nothing really stopping that door being open. They had quite a high level of care inside, but they had this myth and perception that outside was more dangerous. And so some of our job is to be the voice for the garden, the encourager that actually it's a safe place generally. It's no more dangerous than inside. And in fact, there's a large school of thought that too much of just being on flat surfaces indoors only, for many people, they lose the skills to remember about balance and all of those sorts of things, and more likely to have falls. In one particular home we went to, they used the outside as a resource to support building stamina, maintaining balance. They used a wonky lawn to help them instead of a balance board in a gym. And actually they had huge reduction in fall rates within that setting by using their garden as a resource. So yes, there has been progress over the last 10 years. And there's certainly progress in the expectation that we should be able to get outside if we're in a care environment. That has shifted a lot in 10 years, but there is still a lot of work to do. And there's still a lot of homes who find that final step of opening those doors challenging. And we need to start our work there before we even create gardens, because if we don't help them unlock the doors, whatever you create, once the novelty's worn off, there is a high likelihood that they will be back to where they began not that long after you have left, 12 or 18 months down the line. That's not sustainable for anyone, and sadly they don't call us back in to tell us it hasn't worked. But that's kind of my take on it, I guess.
Thank you very much to Debbie for sharing her experience, and thanks to you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 230, Sensory Gardens and Autism, released on March the 27th, 2023, and episode 224, Making Gardening Accessible, released on February the 13th, 2023. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.